Hello and welcome to the Intel Brief. Today is Tuesday, the 19th of May. I am your host Daniel, and today we're going to talk about Trump has said he paused an attack on Iran at the Gulf leader's request. Kenya has been paralyzed by deadly protests and strikes due to the rising cost of fuel. And the US-Nigerian strikes have killed 20 jihadists in the north of the country. So firstly, US President Donald Trump said on Monday that he'd called off a planned US military strike on Iran scheduled for Tuesday, citing a very good chance of reaching a deal to end the war. In a post on Truth Social, Trump said that the Gulf allies, including Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, had urged Washington to delay his attack because of progress made in negotiations with Iran. He added that the US military had been instructed to remain prepared for a full-scale large assault if the talks did fail. In a statement online, the White House said that there seems to be a very good chance that they can work something out. If we do that without bombing the hell out of them, I'd be very happy. Earlier, the US president said that he had declared a fragile 6-week ceasefire, being on life support. So what? I think I'm starting to disbelieve a lot of the statements coming out of the White House and out of Trump himself around this conflict. I think it's unlikely that strikes were planned, and that it's more likely that this is just part of the theatrics of trying to get a good deal out of Iran, though I don't particularly believe Iran is buying this rhetoric either. I think it is possible that further strikes will happen at some point in the future, but it's likely only if any deal is totally dead, or they can't reach a deal that, at least gives Trump some kind of semblance of victory coming out of this conflict. And without completely destroying the US reputation internationally as well. That's another, big takeaway here. And next, at least 4 people have been killed and 30 injured during protests that erupted across Kenya on Monday as crippling public transport strike fueled anger over a sharp rise in the fuel prices linked to the Iran war and disruptions through the Strait of Hormuz. The Interior Minister said in a televised briefing that a number of people were also injured. In the statement, he said, "We lost 4 Kenyans today in the violence, which also saw more than 30 people injured." Last week, Kenya's Energy and Petroleum Regulator raised retail fuel prices by 23.5%, doubling down on the last month's 24.2% hike. Wow, so that's in 2 months, fuel has gone up 50%. Kenya is one of many African countries which is dependent on fuel imports from the Gulf, suspended amid the continued closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So what? I think it seems likely that this type of kind of protests, violence erupting in countries, especially in Africa, is going to become more likely the longer this conflict drags on. It's almost an impossible situation to deal with international fuel prices rising. Poorer countries are finding it more difficult to buy fuel at a sustainable price. It's also possible they'll turn to a country like Russia, who is currently making a premium on their fuel, which is not ideal for the conflict in Iran. But on top of the rising cost of fuel internationally, you also add corruption, both within the governmental systems and within the fuel supply chain into the country. So this just adds more costs at every layer, which, is passed on directly to the consumers and adds to the issues we are seeing in some countries. I think in the long term, countries can start getting fuel in other places, particularly from the US. It's likely we'll start seeing more exports coming out of Africa as well. But prices are going up right now, and that's extremely difficult for countries and leaderships to deal with. And lastly, the United States and Nigeria has conducted fresh strikes on Sunday against the so-called Islamic State jihadists in the northeast of Nigeria's Borno State. The US military said on Monday. They said at least 20 jihadists were killed in the weekend, according to the Nigerian military. The strikes came shortly after a joint operation between the two militaries that killed the leader Abu Bakr al-Manuki the deputy leader of the group's local West African province. The Nigerian military described him as the world's most active terrorist. His assassination marked the first successful targeting of a senior militant leader, by Nigeria's security forces after more than a decade of insurgency by a number of armed groups in the north, including Boko Haram. So what? I think there's benefits in taking out key leaders in the short term, but it's unlikely to have a significant long-term impact. If you can't grind down, other aspects of the militant groups, just removing leadership doesn't really have a great long-term effect. They just get replaced by other people, generally more radical, more extreme, and more prone to violence. But I do think it's likely that the US is going to continue to support Nigeria in fighting back Islamic terrorism in the north of the country. This is particularly around Trump's messaging of wanting to protect Christians worldwide. He leaned heavily on this messaging in his campaign and early on in his presidency, particularly when it came to Nigeria. So I think it's likely that US special operations are going to be conducting, support, advise, and assist ops within Nigeria for the time being, at least, until, things change, ideas change, and priorities change. But that's the way things work. But anyway, that's been your Intel Brief. I've been your host, Daniel, and I'll see you again tomorrow.